with blanket flower. And Gaillardia is a great one that easy to collect seeds. The disc flower dries out, and it's starting to dry out now, depending on where you are in the state. And you can just pinch the top and collect the seed and don't even really have to clean it. It's pretty easy stuff. And I'm a proponent for just spreading that seed immediately. If you know where you want it to go, no need to get all fancy about storing it. Might as well just put it in the ground. It's the perfect time to do that as we move into the fall. Now the blanket flower is my best story about the blanket flower. I used to live in Salida, and you all might know Susan Twite, and she lived there. And she had this beautiful native garden, and it was probably one of the gardens that taught me the most. And the alley downwind of her house was just filled with blanket flower, which shows you that, you know, the natives can really exist in the habitat without too much support, but we need to restore the seed bank. So get those seeds in the ground. Now here we have Asclepias tuberosa, butterfly milkweed. And this is one of my faves for the garden because there's not that many orange native plants. And when it is on a drip in your garden, it can almost take on like a little shrub form. And that's what we're looking at in the center picture. The stature of this mound is probably about 2.5 feet tall by 2.5 feet wide. So it's big deal. And as we all know, important species or a genus for our monarch butterflies. And as I understand it, monarchs do not lay their eggs on this particular Asclepias, but this is a food source for them. And I have only seen this plant growing in the wild one time. And it was while riding my road bike up Cheyenne Canyon, North Cheyenne Canyon. And I'm just, you know, moving at a snail's pace uphill. And I just looked and it was like sticking out of the rock. And that just tells me, you know, how xeric and well adapted it is, sticking out of the side of North Cheyenne Canyon, the south facing side. All right. Where else have you guys seen this plant in the wild? You can write it in the chat. All right, we're gonna move right on. So here we have Ratibida, and everyone loves this. It's so gorgeous. It's so easy to seed in the garden. Once you have a specimen or two, the seed bank where it will start to develop and it'll really grow into a mound. And the colors of the petals kind of change over time. And in the wild, you can see both the red and the yellow combined and the yellow. But take a look at this leaf structure. This is a pretty unique leaf structure. And see how right in the center, there's like this little curl. I can't really think of any other leaves that do that. So it's finely toothed, but then also as it's emerging, it has this neat kind of curling pattern. And now this whole entire cap, as we move into seed collection time, this whole thing will dry off, you know, and then you could just store them in paper bags, shake the bag, and the seeds will just sort of disperse from the cone shape. All right, now here we have prickly pear. So there's 3 species of prickly pear. And right here you're seeing macrorhiza, and I taught native plant master this year, and we thought both polyacantha and macrorhiza in the same field plots in the Garden of the Gods. And what I learned was that the macrorhiza, you know, think about the aerials and how many there are across the pad. And for both species, it's like 5 to 7 or something like that. But in polyacantha, think about the name polyacantha. The aerials are like really profusely spiny, and usually the whole thing looks kind of white. And to my knowledge, that's the only real way to tell them apart. Any other ideas out there? Oh, I see some chat comments. Oh yes, butterfly weed, going back to butterfly weed, pruning off the seed pods to control the spreading. Yes, absolutely. And Kathy has never seen it in the wild. Join the club. um, so the prickly pear, it might not be the thing that you think of as like a great horticultural specimen, but it really is because you have those troubled areas where there's no irrigation, and this would be a great species to start. The other cool thing about cacti is that like if you find a pad on the ground and it's been broken off, or like when we rescued these plants from this pump track development, we cut the prickly pear lobes at the base and we left the roots in place, in case that they would be able to come back on their own after the bulldozers had been there. And then in order to propagate cacti and succulents, you want to like leave it out in the dry. So let me turn my camera so I can see myself. Hold on one sec. So like here's a bunch of jade that I collected from shopping plazas in San Diego. The pieces just fall off under yes, they have jade for their landscaping plants in San Diego. And I don't know if you can see this, but um, it, it's been like a month that they've been sitting on my desk and they're finally rooting out. And so if you're trying to propagate succulents, you need to just let them be and dry out. The drying out is what signals their root development. Stanleyella, everyone loves this plant. It looks kind of weird when it's like small, like in my garden right now. I had to put like a tomato cage around it so I could keep track of it. But it's so gorgeous. And in the wild, I often see this like in a place where there'd be sheeting moisture. And the first time I saw this plant in the wild, we were trying to go backpacking a couple years ago, and it was like wet, wet, wet everywhere. And we ended up in Fruta, and we were like backpacking in the desert. And I remember like it was yesterday, I said to my partner, like, what is that? And we like started just hiking straight towards like this giant yellow bush. And it was the Stanleyella. And so I think it facultatively prefers moisture. And near any rocks in your garden or your sidewalk or whatever, you're going to have a bit more moisture because the water will sheet off of the sidewalk. Okay, so we have Eriogonum. So there's a couple of different buckwheats. I can't recall how many are in this presentation, but essentially the buckwheat is another dryland species. It's kind of in the foothills to montane in the wilds. And take a look at the leaf structure. It's really a great stabilizer. It has basal leaves. And so if you have slopes that are difficult to manage, this would be a great plant to incorporate. And one thing that I love about this plant is the flowers, they just dry in place. So it's kind of a nice like winter interest, or you can cut dried bouquets. And then, you're able to divide this. And I've heard it works pretty good with seed too. And the most amazing thing in Jim Borland's garden in Denver, he had 35-year-old buckwheat, and there's like this huge gnarly root that was like all curved and it was above ground. And if you're hiking on like steep slopes that are eroding, you can see that as well. So a great stabilizing species in your garden, very, very low water. So here we have the Zinnia grandiflora, and this is a very low stature plant. And so it should be like on the edge, of your garden, maybe in your rock garden. In my landscape, again, this plant, I think, it's facultative for it to have more water. If you give it too much water, it will just like kind of fall over. So there's a fine line. But the way I solve that is it's planted at like the bottom of the rock step in the rock garden, not on the top. And so it gets that moisture that would just flow down naturally due to the force of gravity. Here's the famous chocolate flower. Yes, it does really smell like chocolate. It's kind of weird in the garden. I don't know. What do you guys think? It's like the stems don't always go straight up, and it just like has a pretty low stature, but once it gets started, it can really fill up an area, and it has this super cool looking structure as it's developing, and then as it sets the seed. And then this is another one that's just really easy to collect the seed because it's just sitting right on top, and you can just grab it with your fingers. And yeah, so that is Berlandiera leorata, green eyes. I've never heard anyone call it that. Oops, I got off pace here. 1 second. Yeah, so these names right here, just like that's in iNaturalist, right? But we know this as chocolate flower. Yes, the smell is heavenly. It's really wonderful. Okay, so here we have, oh, sorry, we cut off a little bit. Our primrose. So we have lots of primrose, and they come in different colors. In the garden, they can take a rather tall stature, but in the wild, they are pretty small. And so you can see how there's rather large leaves at the bottom. Sometimes I like to prune that. If you prune off these leaves, these look like maybe hail damaged, maybe they got a little dry. Then the plant really sends up more energy towards the blossoms and new stems. And the other cool thing about this picture is a little plant biology. We have the stigma, which is this long piece in the left photo. I don't know if you can see my cursor. That seems to have 4 prongs. And then we have the stamens all around. And so that right there is plant sex. The pollinators come over and they shake off the pollen, and there's the lady parts right there. And as the pollen tube develops, the seed develops at the base of the petals. But generally, it's important to appreciate that petals are just a very expensive showcase to get the job of reproduction done. Here we saw also golden columbine, and there's other columbines, of course, Rocky Mountain columbine. And these species I've seen growing in tree lawns, like with no water at all. But then when they are watered, they can get rather large and pretty open, you know, not a lot of leaf structure, but those gorgeous flowers. But just wait long enough for the seed to develop, which is on the right side. And generally, I like to see that the seed is like drying, you know, before I harvest it. But then in a plant like this in the garden, I would take all of the flower stems off and leave it as a basal mound of leaves. And then you can potentially see a second flowering in the later summer. All right, this one's a underappreciated champion survivor, the Heterotheca villosa. So here down in the southeast, we've got lots of golden asters, really drought tolerant. Notice how like the specimens in the middle are not as hairy, and are middle and left, and then on the right, it's super hairy. And hairiness is an indication of like drought adaptation. So I can't recall, I made these slides like a month ago, but I'm guessing that the middle and left photo were from a garden up north, and the photo on the right was from a garden down here in Colorado Springs. And so the neat thing about this plant, I think its defining feature is A, its hairiness, and B, notice how the leaves are like they're wavy. They do this weird wavy thing, and not a lot of leaves do that. And so when I see just the leaf mound, I usually can tell right away what it is because of that waviness of the leaves. And now in your garden, this could have like a 1 foot stature, but in the like prairie, it would be a low growing plant. So here we have the Helianthus pumilus, the little sunflower. And sunflowers, we all know about beautiful sunflowers, great great joy of the late season, and it extends the pollinator resource. Another thing to think about is like a lot of yellow flowers are late season flowers. And that goes all the way to like rabbit brush, right? And this is important for us to incorporate different colors, not just because it looks nice, but because typically the abundance of certain colors is seasonal, right? So like you have a more purple garden in the early season and a more yellow one in the late season. And there's red and oranges like the Asclepias tuberosa and the Penstemon barbatus in there, you know, somewhere in the middle there. Sunflower seeds, I'm sure I need no explanation for collecting. They spread wildly throughout the garden. And I found that like sometimes I want to move the sunflowers so I can make like fun things for my kids or create little shade barriers. And when the sunflowers are just, you know, about 6 to 8 inches tall, you can easily transplant them. Just take one shovelful and move them. And so you can make like teepees. I've made the Three Sisters garden this year. And I think that like the vines are preferring to grow on the sunflowers because the stems are and the leaves are like more rough and the corn is more smooth. Oh yes, Kathy is saying that Heterotheca blooms forever. It absolutely does. And Kathy lives like up like Carter Lake. And you know, once you get up into that wildland interface, you know, a plant like this, it's just in your garden because it's part of the wild landscape. Oh, sulfur butterflies, wonderful. Heterotheca is great for sulfur butterflies. Remind me, we will look those up in iNaturalist. Okay, so this was in John Jordanengo's garden, where he has a stream in a little pond. And he and I have been like emailing about it for like a week because I just went backpacking in the Maroon Bells. And I took a picture of like a mountain stream that looks exactly like his backyard, like this one spot in his backyard. So monkey flower, you know, is a kind of plant that is like really mesic and it wants to be constantly water. And if you have a water feature in your garden, this would be a great plant to have basically growing right in it. And it's a kind of early successional species, so it might not last forever, but hopefully it will, you know, reseed itself. But just such gorgeous flowers and fine with the park shade. And another one I will note is up at Camp Shady Brook, like growing right in the water. I've seen Veronica, and I'm not sure what species it was, but looked so gorgeous. So imagine Veronica and the monkey flower together. That would look really nice. So we have our blue flax, and the blue flax are I have always thought of them as an early season plant, but that they're moisture driven plant. And so they have these fine blooms. And the most interesting thing I saw at the garden tour was that someone had Lewisii growing right next to a cultivar called Narbonense. And the Narbonense had like 5 to 6 times as many blooms. It was like gaudy almost. And it was just interesting to watch them right next to each other. And so I want to take a moment to talk about cultivars. So like there are native plants in the Plant Select program, and there are native cultivars. And when we think about, you know, our use of cultivars in the garden, it's not, people have lots of opinions about this. And essentially, I want you to think about how like the functionality of the plant, right? The Narbonense is the same color, and even though it has the same blooms, or it has many more blooms, like to a pollinator, I'm guessing that it's very similar. But then when you get into like species where the variation of the native changes the petal color, research has shown that like pollinators just don't recognize that plant at all. So you don't have to be like really harsh and dogmatic about your plant choices. Maybe a Plant Select cultivar, native cultivar comes to you. It's okay. It's okay. I've got like a lot of plants like penstemons in my common harebell. And I think of this as like a good plant for a park shade shade setting. In the wild, you see it more like in the montane or in the shady foothills, and maybe up into the semi-subalpine. But these are delicate plants. They have like no leaf interest. So it's good to get a good patch going of them to appreciate their blooms. And they have extensive blooms, you know, they can continue to put up stems and new flowers. Monarda fistulosa, and this is a great species for the full sun garden. And right here where we're seeing it, it's about 4 feet tall. So I had this idea that a lot of people in the garden tours were watering their gardens a lot because, you know, they were going to be on display, because I saw a lot of natives that were way bigger than I expected them to be. But this is a great plant, and I have recently learned from my indigenous friend Alex Crochet, the city horticulturalist here in Colorado Springs, that the entirety of the Monarda plant is edible. And so that's good to know, just interesting ethnobotanical information, but also when it's growing in your garden, you can experiment with it. All right, so now we are on to the 4 o'clock. So this summer I found that there are a couple of mirabilis around that I didn't really ever recognize before. Today we saw one, I'm blanking on the species, but it was kind of in under juniper, and it was like a little vine, and it had the same exact flower, but it was minuscule. And it almost looked like bindweed, but it was not bindweed. And there's another mirabilis that kind of grows up in the alleys and stuff, and that's like an annual, I think. And I'm sorry, I don't have those species names at the tip of my tongue right now. But this is one where I found that when you implement it in the garden, like the stems are a little brittle when they're young, and so I've broken many stems in the Kathleen marriage garden just with the hose. So I started to use a tomato cage to just kind of protect it until it got to more of a shrub form. And here in the left picture, if you can see my cursor, like at 1 o'clock in the left picture, you can see those seeds are developing there. Okay, so this is our native echinacea. So people love to talk about how echinacea purpurea is not native to Colorado. It's a near native. It's native to Montana. And so, you know, again, when we think about like how strict are we going to be? And I'm sure people disagree with me on the points I'm making, but echinacea in your garden, probably better than some bleeding hearts or, you know, something like that. But if you want to get real serious, it's this echinacea, the Pallida, that is the native to Colorado. And wait, I see a typo in here. I'm not sure. Oh no, maybe that's not. And E. angustifolia to me is Elaeagnus angustifolia because I used to study Russian olive. But yes, okay, 2 species there. This was growing in Maddie Mayer's garden, and I had never seen it before growing in a garden. It looked so beautiful. I'm not sure exactly where she got it, but obviously it was available. And it's not quite as showy as the purpurea, but it has this gorgeous detail that you just don't see in the purpurea. So try out the native echinacea if you see it in the nursery. Linarius. Oh, Kathy, that might have been what we saw today. It was brand new to me. I was out on a plant inventory with Kurt today in Manitou Springs. And I don't think I've pressed upload on my iNaturalist yet, but I'll do that now. We could circle back to this. Okay, so let's think about now the wine cups. And this is an interesting species because it is so gorgeous and the blooms just don't stop. but it definitely needs more water. It's really not that xeric. Like for example, you know, I have new neighbors and it's just been rocking this year and I did not understand why. And then I was raking off some pea gravel to plant some seeds and I realized like that my neighbor's irrigation was on about 6 inches of my rock garden and the wine cup was along that edge. And so that gave me a lot to think about that like sometimes you have places where abundance of water just occurs and it's not at your hand, maybe it's near your drain spout or whatever. And these are places where you could choose certain species that prefer a bit more moisture and put them there without watering them more. And so now I'm trying it out in kind of a more shady spot to see if I can keep the blooms going. It's blooming right now, even though, you know, it's not right there by my neighbor's sprinkler. So here we have the Asclepias speciosa, and this is the species that the monarchs lay their eggs on. And the story of the milkweeds is that they're imperiled to an extent due to our agricultural history. They're poisonous to cattle, and so when they are in the rangeland, then they're usually, you know, mitigated. But interestingly, you can find great swaths of them along our highways. Our highways are really a great harbor for native plants because they remain independent of the agricultural pressures that our landscapes face. And CDOT, like probably the worst thing CDOT does is like they weed whack, right? And so if you are in a mood to affect change in your environment, wherever you are, like one really important thing you can do is just talk to your highway managers about like when are they doing that, you know. You want them to do that after the seed has set, so you still can replenish the seed bank. So here's some purple prairie clover, and it looks pretty similar to the Ratibida, but notice that the petals are totally different. The Ratibida had those more yellow and red petals. And here we're seeing these gorgeous orange stamens. And the Dahlia is very easy to collect seed on, just as we said. And in this middle picture, what we're seeing, I'm guessing, and what I see in my garden is that, you know, the seeds drop in place. So you end up with a mound that's growing over time. And then you can, in the fall, just kind of like cleave off the perimeters of it and plant those sections in other areas to propagate plants vegetatively in your own garden. And we can see here too, like the leaves, they're not exactly like the Ratibida. They're both like narrow and these are very hairy and they don't have that little curl thing that I was talking about at the tip of the leaf. So just thinking about what you might be looking for before the flowers are there. Oh, Judith Rice Jones, Highway 76 outside Boulder, the pollinator highway planted by CDOT. Oh, that's wonderful. Yes, and so with down here in the Southeast, like Allie Shook, our watershed coordinator, she always gives people seed bombs, right? And like the idea is just that we just need to restore the seed bank. And when we're in places like our bike paths and highway medians and alleys, you know, we can restore that seed bank no problem, especially if it's of no cost to us by collecting our own seeds. All right, so here's the Rocky Mountain bee plant. Paratoma cerulata. I thought it was Cleome. Maybe it has changed. Any thoughts? So we were chatting about this earlier. This is one where it's an annual. And where I've seen it in the wild are the craziest, most degraded places. Like the biggest collection of this plant I've ever seen is out east here in Colorado Springs. We got a bunch of open space properties that are not like open yet to the public. And I think this was at Big Blue Stem Prairie, if anyone is familiar with that. And we were out on the BioBlitz and we were like far off. And it was kind of like a place where like erosion had caused degradation by like covering things up repeatedly, right? So it's sand drainage. And there was Rocky Mountain bee plant that was like 7 feet tall, 7 feet wide, like huge mound of it. So Jamesia americana, this species I think I've been looking at for a long time, thinking it was something else, but again, during Native Plant Master this summer, I became familiar with this plant in Cheyenne Canyon, and again, it's growing right out of the rock. However, it was on the north side, not on the south side, like the Asclepias tuberosa. And obviously here in the garden specimen, it also makes a beautiful shrub. And white flowers are, there aren't that many white forbs, but there are a lot of white flowering shrubs. And so if you're a fan of white flowers, really consider including more shrubs in your landscape. And shrubs, by the way, they are excellent pollinator partners. They really offer 4-season habitat for all kinds of species. And they provide food in the form of pollen and nectar, and in the form of berries, and habitat in their woody structure. Okay, so this was the neatest plant I saw in the garden tours, and this was in Kathy Mayer's garden. And we walked out to the hinterlands of her garden. This rock in the top of this right picture is like the edge of the driveway, basically. And I'll let Kathy, you can describe it. It was kind of like a prickly vine, but with these gorgeous flowers. How's it looking these days?
It looks about the same, although it stopped blooming. It's been so dry out there. And it's, when I first read about this plant, I understood it liked moist areas, and I was really surprised to see it growing on this bank and in very dry areas of this field that we have. But I'm just super glad to see it. It's a wonderful ground cover, but it could use a little more moisture to look its best.
Thank you. All right, so this plant is every botany lecturer's favorite thing to talk about. So common yarrow, Achillea millefolium. It's one of these plants that doesn't change species, right? It's very widespread across the state, and it's the same species everywhere you see it, all the way from the prairie to the alpine. And the thing that changes about it is its stature and its hairiness, depending on how much moisture is available. And this is another great plant with ethnobotanical importance. If you are out in the field, you can make a pumice of the leaves, just like chew them a little bit if you're bleeding, and it's aseptic and antiseptic, so it helps to fight infection and also stop bleeding. And you can make yarrow tea, although I'm not sure right off the top of my head what the prescription is for yarrow tea. Like, what does it do for you? But I have started, when backpacking, just taking a couple of leaves of plants like yarrow or raspberry and just putting them in my water, making tea at night. And that doesn't harvest the plant. It just helps me feel a little bit more connected with the landscape. All right, so this one I think everyone should have in their garden. It's all over our landscape. And Artemisia frigida, you're looking at it, it doesn't really have very showy flowers, but it's the leaves that are showy, and they're really beautiful aroma that it lets off. And there are several species of Artemisia in Colorado. Ludovicana has like a broader leaf. And there's also campestris, which is very weird. It's not really whitish. It has a red stem. That's also in Artemisia. Then also we have like tridentata, the big shrub sage. And so these are all great specimens for your native garden. I have heard many people say that Ludovicana is bossy, right? Like it's a good ground cover, but if you want a nice, neat garden, you might not want to introduce that species. It spreads by rhizomes. So it kind of just comes out of the ground, and doesn't necessarily have a nice clump form. Now, this picture on the left, like in the wild, I would never see this big, right? So this is definitely like an irrigated garden specimen, but if you weren't watering it at all, it would maintain like a 6 to 8 inch stature. And I just like it because it just adds like more leaf texture to the landscape. It's really pretty. And it's very easy to work with. And as we were saying at the beginning, like Kathy gave me some and that did not work. But if you can, get a little clump from your neighbor, some that's well adapted to your local landscape, that would be best. Okay, so now, we got chat items. Okay, so Kathy says at least 12 inches by me without water. So that's the difference between like Loveland and Colorado Springs. And so your landscape's probably a lot wetter than you realize. Okay, so here we have Apache plume. This is another shrub with beautiful white flowers. But what is even more beautiful are the seeds. And so in the lower right, you'll see that basically until wind, hail, or snow takes them away, what you are left with once they go to seed are these gorgeous little, what I would call Fraggle heads. If anyone remembers the cartoon Fraggle Rock, it's just this gorgeous little hairy thing. And in the morning dew, it catches the light, and in like any low angle light, it's just super gorgeous. And also, like underlighting in your garden, this would be a great specimen for underlighting in your garden. Oh, well, it is 6:53, and I guess that's all the slides I have.